When you watch the mainstream media news, do you feel a little twitch? Is there a tingle in your left hand? Is your jaw locked? We have the solution. Welcome to Reasonable Arguments, the podcast where thoughtful debate meets unfiltered fun. Coming to you from Sarasota, Florida, we mix informed conservative commentary, playful banter, and just the right amount of nonsense to keep it entertaining. This is Reasonable Arguments, and now your host.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, and this is Reasonable Arguments. Today we have an extraordinary guest joining us, Matthew John Heath, a decorated U.S. Marine Corps veteran who served in the early battles of the Iraq War. In September 2020, Matthew was arrested in Venezuela on what the U.S. government has described as baseless charges of terrorism and weapons trafficking. He spent over 2 years wrongfully detained in one of Venezuela's most infamous prisons, enduring harsh conditions and isolation before his release in a prisoner exchange in October 2022. Since returning home, Matthew has become an advocate for other Americans facing similar ordeals. In this episode, he'll share his firsthand account of survival, resilience, and what it really means to be held hostage abroad. So, Matthew, I just want to thank you for joining me today. First of all, thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for coming on today to share your story with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you again, and thank you. My service in the Marine Corps and in the Army, they're a big part of my personality. And, I'll always love the Marine Corps.
That's great. All right. So let's jump into this. As you said, you served as a U.S. Marine Corps veteran with specialization in communications and signals intelligence, including early Iraq war services.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the key experiences from your military time that shaped you?
Well, Marines are known for being tough. And, I like to think that growing up on a farm in East Tennessee gave me a good start on being tough. But, there's a reason that the Marine Corps exists. And, those experiences that I got from serving in the Marine Corps for 4 years it was really instrumental in my personality. That gave me the foundation for my entire career. And, later what we'll get into is my experiences in Venezuela. I came back to the Marine Corps quite a few times. As some of the most pivotal experiences for me was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I was there on the first days, and those were some really interesting days.
So when you enlist like that, do you think you're going to go to war, or is it just one of those things that, yeah, it could happen, but probably not going to happen to me?
I enlisted when I was 17, and to be quite honest with you, the thought just never crosses your mind. But we had a little saying in the Marine Corps where they said the captain could come out, look at 100 guys and say, guys, we're hitting the beach tomorrow and we're expecting 90% casualties. And every Marine there thinks he's invincible. Every Marine looks to his left and his right and goes, man, it sucks to be you guys, because you never think you're going to be the guy that doesn't make it.
Right.
So that's the mindset we had. We just thought we were invincible.
Wow. Okay, so after leaving the Marines in 2004, you worked in security consulting and purchased a yacht to start a Caribbean charter business.
Yeah.
So what led you to Venezuela?
Well, that's a long period of time from 2004 to 2020, and I had a really great time contracting with the U.S. government, providing security to different members, different departments in the government. In 2016, I had been working in Iraq every year from 2004 to 2016, and to be quite honest with you, I'd gotten a little tired. I got a little tired of working in Iraq. It was, it's a difficult environment to be working for the United States government in Iraq. And, some of those years were pretty difficult. And I had saved up a pretty good amount of money. And I thought, you know what? I love the ocean. I love sailing. I love nature. The Caribbean is a little bit friendlier than Iraq. So I partially retired and I was sailing around the Caribbean, having a great time, making a little bit of money as a charter captain. And like a lot of sailors, I had some girlfriends in different areas, and I had a really good friend of mine live down in Cartagena, and I was spending some time with her. And this was during the COVID crisis. So all the airports closed, all the borders closed. And I had met a Venezuelan person who told me that no problem, Matthew. You're trying to go to Aruba. There are boats in Venezuela that go to Aruba every day. Just come with us, and we can get you out of here. And like a guy who maybe has taken the risks when he shouldn't have, I thought, yeah, sure, okay, I'll go to Venezuela. Yes, the governments of the United States and Venezuela have problems, but that doesn't involve me. I don't have any problems with the Venezuelan government. And unfortunately, that's not how the Venezuelan government saw it. So that's what led up to my detention.
So, like, coming from someone who doesn't have military experience or anything like that, did they go through that kind of stuff? Like, are you taught like what countries you can be friends with and you can't be friends with,
Mhm.
or like how is that just a learned experience? Like, how does all that happen?
That's a great question. So I can't speak for the entire military, but as someone who came from an intelligence unit, there absolutely are travel restrictions on what countries when you're active duty and especially in intelligence. And it's all the countries that you would imagine, North Korea, Russia, there are restrictions on like Belarus, China, the countries that are adversarial or competitors of the United States. Those are the countries that we don't want active duty intelligence members to go to. That being said, as a civilian, it's a little bit more, the onus is on the person. And there are absolutely U.S. State Department travel advisories to not go to Venezuela. I ignored those to my peril.
Wow. So there were at that time, don't go to Venezuela.
To be honest with you, imagine that there were. I didn't check at the time.
Yeah. I
And,
mean,
who thinks to check on the travel advisories?
exactly. That is absolutely nothing I would even think of to do ever.
I mean, that's something that, I mean, most Americans, we think about traveling in the United States from one state to another, that kind of stability. And a lot of people take that when they go to traveling to other countries because a lot of our experience, like for example, the Bahamas. Now, the Bahamas has a different legal system, but it's a British legal system.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of similarities with the United States. People feel very safe. And then unfortunately, that kind of complacency when you do end up traveling to a country that has a very different government, very different legal systems, that's where people can run into trouble.
Well, and I know we'll talk about this later,
Yeah.
as far as prevention, but I think that's one of the things. We just came off a cruise, and I know people go on cruises and go into these
Hmm.
different countries and think, oh, well, I'm coming in on a cruise ship, so I'm safe
Hmm.
no matter what. And I know my husband and I went on a cruise last year and heard horror stories of people in I think we were in Jamaica actually, who took a taxi, and the taxi cab basically held them hostage, saying, "I'm not letting you out of the cab until you pay me $600."
Yeah.
And
It's those
I
kind of
mean,
opportunistic threats.
yes.
Well, that is one facet of the security situation where, the income differences are so large. Like a lot of Americans, let's say like a nice middle class family making, let's just say $100,000 a year, they certainly don't think of themselves as wealthy. Those kind of, somebody making $100,000 a year, they don't think I'm going to be kidnapped. They think, well, a billionaire could be kidnapped. Somebody worth $100 million could be kidnapped. But the reality is when you travel to countries that, their GDP might be, per capita GDP might be $5,000 a year, all of a sudden the $600 that you can get out of the ATM machine, that's a significant enough amount of money for somebody, a criminal in a really poor country, to motivate them to do those kind of opportunistic kidnappings.
Walk us through the day of what happened. So
Okay.
you go into Venezuela,
Yeah.
and what happens?
So I'm riding in a taxi on the way to the port where I'm going to take my boat to take to or take the ferry to Aruba. And a day just like any other. I got up, I ate breakfast. I'm having a nice day. I have no idea that the worst day of my life just started. Like a lot of countries with difficult security situations, Venezuela has internal checkpoints, and they're pretty reasonable. So the military just checking cars to make sure that there aren't any gang members or guerrilla groups traveling around. And the Venezuelan soldier, he says, "Can I see your passport?" And I'm like, "Of course, here you go." And it was like, "Oh my goodness, jackpot, an American. Come right this way, sir. You're under arrest."
He said that right then and there.
Yeah, oh well, they weren't as polite as that. There was a little bit more yelling and grabbing.
Oh
I'm
my
churching
God.
it up a little bit. No, they just immediately, as soon as I showed him my passport, he grabbed my arm to make sure that I mean, I was sitting in a car, but he grabbed my arm to make sure that I couldn't even run away or anything. He's like, "Okay, yes, you're immediately under arrest."
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was shocking. I was charged with arms trafficking, treason, and terrorism. And I cannot describe to you, so I found that out over the next few days, how shocking it was. I was convinced for the first few days there's been a terrible
Right.
paperwork mistake. You have me confused with someone else. There's been a mix up with the paperwork. I have no idea what you're talking about. And I was extremely ignorant of the political situation, which is there are countries like Russia, China, Venezuela that use the wrongful detention of Americans as a policy tool. So it's not actually an accident. This is a calculated maneuver for negotiations.
Now, are you able to speak to them? Are they speaking English? Is there that kind of language barrier?
So I do speak fluent Spanish now. At the time, I did not speak very good Spanish. There was no communication to begin with. Unfortunately, in the beginning, it's extremely confusing as an American who's detained. There's a language barrier. And like I said at the beginning, I thought this was some kind of terrible accident. I came to find out later, after speaking with some of the other political prisoners in Venezuela, that this is not an accident. There's what we call the combo pack of the political dissidents of Venezuela. It's the standard set of charges that the government gives anybody they don't like: terrorism, treason, financing terrorism. These are whenever people like me, when I do my analysis, I can look at a political dissident pretty quickly and tell if they are actually somebody who has done something, or if they're just simply somebody that the Venezuelan government doesn't like. They have a playbook that they use.
Wow. I would have been like you. I'd have been like, okay, well, once they search my bags, they're going to see I don't
Yeah,
have anything and be like, okay,
yeah,
sorry, we're going to let you
yeah,
go now.
yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, so you were held in one of Venezuela's most notorious prisons. Yeah, and we talked yesterday, so I know we're not going to go
hmm
into grave detail about that, and that's to protect your family, which is completely understandable. But what were the daily conditions like? Like, what did you see every day?
Yeah. So I was held. There are two political prisons in Venezuela. I was at the one called Casa de los Sueños, which means the House of
Sounds pretty.
Dreams. It sounds like a daycare that you would drop your kids off. It sounds nice. The House of Dreams. It is not a nice place. So it's where all the VIP, the high level political cases are held in Venezuela. There's a lot of Venezuelan military officers. So the rank of colonel to general, anybody who opposes the Maduro government is just immediately placed in prison if they're a military officer. There's absolutely no freedom of speech or freedom of opinion in the military in Venezuela. What did a normal day look like? Well, it's a maximum security prison ran by sadists. It is a it is a really terrible place to be. And it's one of the things that you just have to endure. You just have to be a tough person. And if you're not a tough person, you're going to become a tough person. It's months and months of isolation, no communication. So I wasn't allowed to communicate with anybody, with my family for the first 11 months. And the only reason that I was allowed to finally make a phone call is because I went on a hunger strike, and they believe me. I was a tough guy. I said, "I'm not going to eat until you guys give me a phone call." So after about 5 days, they gave me a phone call, which, to be quite honest with you, was like a walk in the park because of the poor treatment I'd received in Venezuela. Not eating for 5 days back then was, well, that.
So why is that a bartering tool? Just because they're still using you as a pawn to the US, they don't want
Yeah.
anything to happen to you, so they take that seriously and like, oh, we can't lose this guy and let's let him call home.
It's an interesting dichotomy. On one side of the ledger, a detained American is like a Fabergé egg. It is worth more than any person could be. And then on the other side, it's a communist regime. It's effectively a communist regime. They call it socialist. So they take military officers in Venezuela, go to Moscow for their training. The Cubans are, the high level advisors for the Maduro government. The Venezuelans imagines the Soviet Union from 1950. So there might not even be a purpose for keeping someone from communicating. So we see, like in Russia, that when Americans are detained in Russia, they have a process. They're very legalistic, but Americans are allowed to communicate just like any other prisoner. However, in Venezuela, there's not really a system. It seems almost like they would do things just to be sadistic.
Yeah, they probably don't have a process or procedures that they have to follow. So does the military train you for anything like this?
Well, not everyone in the U.S. military gets certain types of training. We call it isolated personnel training. So, for example, prisoner of war would be a subset of isolated personnel. So, like if a pilot ejected over, enemy spaces, he hadn't been captured, but now he's an isolated personnel. So he's going to face certain kinds of challenges. I have received, as part of my work with the U.S. government, isolated personnel training. And I went back to that well many times while I was in Venezuela. I'll give you one example. You take the little victories where you can, and anything that the administration at the prison wanted me to do, I would do the opposite.
Just because.
Well, for example, you can see I've got short hair today. I like having short hair. They wanted us to have short hair in the prison. I grew my hair out to my shoulders. I personally hated it, but whatever that I could do to do the opposite of what they wanted, that's what I did.
Now, but you honestly don't know whether or not they're going to kill you. You just don't know.
So for the first couple of weeks, I absolutely was concerned that they were going to kill me. The treatment was pretty rough. So I was tortured and interrogated for several weeks before we moved into a different phase of my captivity. But once I realized that they weren't going to kill me, then I was able to push back on some of the treatment. And that allowed me a little bit more freedom. And more importantly, it allowed me some mental victories. So the average detention in Venezuela is around 24 months. Mine was 25. Some people come out sooner, some people come out longer. And it's a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. So the mental resilience was probably the biggest key. And that's actually in my work as a consultant with corporations. When we talk to executives about preparation, we have to set realistic goals for these guys. You have to understand that once you've been detained, it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. And you've got to have that mental toughness. And sometimes those victories could just be, I'm not going to cut my hair. Now, does that really move the needle? No, not really. That didn't get me home anymore. But what it did is it fed my spirit. It helped my heart stay strong. And, those kinds of little victories, that's what I try to teach to people.
So when did you know they weren't going to kill you? Like, was it something that happened or just a duration?
Well, you know what? The real moment came when I had eventually been moved to Casa de los Sueños from the interrogation facility, and there was an amazing Venezuelan military officer who had been in prison for his opposition to President Maduro. He spoke fluent English. He was able to speak to me for just a moment and say, "It's okay, Matthew. You're going to make it. They're not going to kill you. They're going to use you to trade." And that was my first introduction to the politics. Now, that officer was punished for speaking to me. He was moved to another part of the prison because he spoke to me in English. Just for a
Wow.
moment.
Now, have you talked to him at all?
So I don't want to say his name on the podcast just because he's actually still in prison in Venezuela for political
Wow.
purposes. So he is one of the best military officers I've ever met anywhere in the world. There are some amazing military officers with honor and courage and honesty. And you know where those people are found in Venezuela?
In prison.
They're found in prison. It's opposite world down there.
That's amazing. I mean, this man doesn't even realize that he changed your whole trajectory of being there. I mean, probably
I will
saved your
tell
life.
you, I'm still in contact with his family. We became good friends, and I think that when the government transitions to, I'm not sure who the next leader is going to be in Venezuela, but this officer will be the next Minister of Defense, in my opinion.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. So, and I read this in one of the articles that I read about you, that you described resisting captors by breaking surveillance equipment and refusing sham court hearings early on.
Yeah.
And so listening to you now, that's kind of things that kept you motivated.
Yeah, so that's two different things that I want to address separately. Breaking the cameras and they would put listening devices and they would plant listening devices in my cell, and I really enjoyed breaking the cameras. That was something that gave me a lot of joy. As far as refusing to take part in the trial, once I realized that I was being completely framed, they planted evidence, they had false witnesses. I felt like it was a matter of my integrity, and that I thought back to the show trials in the Soviet Union, and I thought, I'm giving dignity to this trial that 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 degrades me as a person. That degrades my integrity. And because as a protest to how ridiculous the trial was, I said, I'm not going to participate in this. I refuse to participate in something that was a lie.
Now, how can you do that? How can you refuse to participate?
There actually is a legal procedure in Venezuela where I declined to attend my hearing. So the trial continues. You just don't attend it. Yeah. So that was my way of saying, I don't care what you do. I know that this entire process is false. And it was also a recognition that, the legal system in Venezuela isn't free. So my freedom was going to come from the United States government trading with the Venezuelan government. Well, I recognized that pretty early.
So I'm picturing basically like a movie set where they have the same
Hmm.
actors, the
Yeah.
same script, just a
Yeah.
different person that is on trial is basically what they're doing.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, you gotta realize, like, the players might change, but the play stays the same. So the Venezuelan justice system, the judges aren't free to make their own decisions. If they make a decision that's not politically acceptable, they'll immediately be thrown in prison.
Oh my God. Who makes that decision? If it's not the judge, who's above the judge?
Well, oh, it's the Maduro regime. Well, I should say it was the Maduro regime.
Right, right. That's insane to me. So what is the purpose of the trial? I mean, if they're holding you as a pawn, what is the is that just like showmanship? Like, okay, we're actually going to try the and
Well, there's two markets. So you got to remember my thesis here, which is Venezuela is the Soviet Union from the 1950s. There's two markets for this type of propaganda. There's the internal market, there's the external market. So internally, they're going to use this kind of propaganda, which is to solidify the people. So a lot of people don't understand that these are just false lies. And the common people think a lot of the common people in Venezuela, they think that they're under attack. They believe that these stories that that the Venezuelan government's constantly arresting CIA spies sent to assassinate President Maduro, which
oh
of
my
course is
goodness.
just ridiculous. So internally, it's used for political purposes. Externally, it's used for propaganda.
Okay. So when we talked yesterday, one of the questions I asked was how your family found out that you
Yeah.
had been taken, because they
Yeah.
didn't necessarily reach out to the US immediately,
Hmm.
but it was through TV.
Well, so my family was contacted by the U.S. State Department about a week after, I think about a week after I was detained. U.S. Embassy monitors Venezuela's radio station, so they'd heard it on the news. That being said, within a couple of weeks, President Maduro gave an address at the United Nations General Session and announced that his forces had arrested a CIA spy sent to attack his country. And the guys at the State Department put two and two together, connected the dots. And that's pretty early on, the U.S. government realized that I was going to be framed for, just a ridiculous made up story. And pretty early on, the U.S. government got the wheels turning to include me in the negotiations.
In June of 2022, I had read that you staged a non-lethal suicide attempt. This was
Yeah.
your way of basically getting out to somewhere. So walk me
Yeah.
through what happened.
Well, as a Marine, as a soldier, I know a little bit about human anatomy. Normally, it's for when we're hurting people. So, as part of my work with the U.S. government and part of my training, I understood that if I injured myself in a non-lethal way, my life wouldn't be in danger, but I'd be moved to a lower security facility. And that was actually part of a larger escape plan. Unbeknownst to me, it also almost politically got me out of there. The United States and Venezuelan government, they immediately realized that I was just too tough of a cookie. They didn't like me there. Everybody was going to try to get me home. Unfortunately, there were some political complications between Ambassador James Story and the opposition leader Juan Guaido. The details are not very interesting, but unfortunately, that delayed my release a few months. But I think it was a big part of getting me out of there. When my 2-year mark came up, I had communicated privately to the U.S. government that once the 2-year mark came up, that my patience was running a little thin and I was probably going to take matters into my own hands and try to walk out of there.
Like physically escape.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd been moved to a hospital and I had started gathering the supplies I needed to escape the facility.
So that they held you at the hospital because of your injury or because of you having that mindset?
No, so they moved me to the hospital for surgery. That was not the first time they'd hospitalized me. That was the first time I hospitalized myself. And then while I was there, it's a military hospital, and there's a one wing that's for prisoners. A military hospital with a prison wing. It's not a lot of people have been to something like that.
It's just beyond me, and I can't even imagine what this hospital was like. I mean, it couldn't be anything state of the art by any means.
Yeah, I mean, the Venezuelan hospital it's a perfect snapshot of Venezuela, a country absolutely blessed with almost every natural resource and an amazing climate, some of the largest oil reserves in the world, and the people live in total poverty. It's a crime against humanity the way that the Maduro government has ran the country. Their hospitals should be like the hospitals in Finland or the United Arab Emirates, countries that have massive sovereign wealth funds, and instead they don't have running water in some of their facilities there.
Wow.
So if you can imagine a hospital that doesn't have running water,
Yeah. I mean,
that's
that
pretty
surgery had to
difficult
be
to
great.
imagine. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So describe the moment that you learned about the prisoner exchange that
Uh,
did free you
That's an
and
easy one.
6 others, right?
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, the Venezuelan government and I had a pretty adversarial relationship, so they didn't give me
They're
any
like,
kind
"Get
of
him
heads
out of
up.
here. We don't even want him here anymore. We'll just take someone else."
Yeah, they did not want me down there. But no, I was woken up at 6 in the morning and I was told to get dressed and that I was leaving that day. And I promptly cursed them out and told them to go away because
You didn't
I
believe
didn't
them.
believe them. I didn't believe them. Psychological warfare that they conduct on not just me, but all the prisoners, all the people that have been detained. It's a classic military intelligence playbook, and I just didn't believe them. So eventually, they brought one of the detainees. This really amazing guy was in the oil industry in Texas. They brought him in to visit me, and he spoke English, and he says, "Matthew, you're going home today." They said, "You're going home today," and I was like, "Oh, they're just lying." He's like, "No, the car is waiting on you. You
Oh
have
my
to
god.
get ready right now." There's a really great guy named Pedro Leon, and he is this old man, real sweet guy. And he's like, "No, Matthew, they're not kidding. You need to get ready." And I was like, "I'm ready. Let's go." Oh,
And that was
it
it.
was it was a good day.
You left there and then you get to the
Yeah.
plane and they had to do I think they called it an identity confirmation. right?
Yeah, yeah. So we did what's called a proof of life. Again, when you're working with kidnaps, proof of life, even with when the governments, perform these wrongful detentions, it's extremely similar to a kidnap. So we were all videotaped, all seven of us, and we had to give our name and social security number, and then that was sent to the White House to confirm that we were who we were. We're getting on the plane. We're flown to a small Caribbean island, and we were exchanged for the nephews of President Maduro.
Wow. I can't even imagine like flying into that island and being like, okay, this is just going to be another drop point. Like I'm truly not going home.
So the other six guys were they were going nuts. They were screaming and laughing and patting each other on the back. And one of the guys who had become a pretty good friend of mine, he said, "Matthew, like what's wrong? Like celebrate." And we just landed. And I said, they can turn this plane around and just run back down the runway and we'd be heading back to Venezuela. And it wasn't pessimism, it was just a very guarded optimism, realism. I wasn't happy until I was sitting in the American plane.
Absolutely. Yeah. So US was waiting for you there at that next island then.
They weren't waiting. They landed just after we did, as well as they could. Both teams had planned to land at the same time, and within minutes, the U.S. landed. It was a team that was from the State Department, led by a guy that we like to nickname Captain America. It's Ambassador Roger Carstens. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel, Special Forces. He's one of the most amazing people in the world, and he was the negotiator that got me out. And when I saw Roger, that's when I knew I was going home.
That was
Yeah.
it. I can't even imagine how surreal that was.
He's a person that you immediately trust when you meet him. He'd been able to visit me twice in my 2 years of captivity. As part of his negotiations with the Venezuelan government, he was allowed to visit people like me. Yeah, it was surreal is a good way to put it. It was like a baptism. It was the beginning of my life again.
Now I read, and I don't know if this is true, but I read that while you were in captivity, you had the opportunity to, I guess through doors or whatever it was, speak to the other detainees that were there and kind of motivate them or keep them
Yeah,
motivated while you
yeah.
were there. How did you do that?
Yeah, so a large period of my time was in solitary confinement, but there were periods where we were in a different part of the prison, and we were able to speak to each other through the windows and the doors. So our doors had little windows, and you couldn't see anybody, but you could hear somebody's voice in the hallway. And I did try to have a ridiculous optimism, which going back to my work in consulting, that's one of the keys that I talk to people about is when you're detained, you have one job, and that's to stay alive. This entire process, what's going on outside, you think you're going to take part in that. And the reality is that's not going to happen. Your job is to survive. And a lot of times that comes down to your mentality, maintaining a positive attitude. So I'll tell you one thing that I did every Sunday. So every Sunday we would have church in the main part of when I was in the main part of the prison. And every Sunday I would call out to all the guys. I say, guys, I got some really good news. And somebody'd say, what is it? And I say, I think we're going to have a good news this week. And I remember one time one of the guys yelled at me. He said, Matthew, you say that every week. And I said, I'm going to say it every week until something good happens.
Yeah, exactly. That's
So,
amazing.
yeah, I would just say that every Sunday. That was part of my procedure is I had a habit. Every Sunday I would say something good's going to happen this week.
Now, did you give them little tidbits about breaking stuff in their cell and being combative and adding that to your
So
motivational speech?
So I didn't encourage anybody to break anything because you're pretty heavily punished. You're pretty heavily punished for those kinds of things. Uh, I tell people if you're going to be dumb, you better be tough. So there were some pretty heavy physical punishments for breaking those kinds of things. And I like to think that I took the North Korea option. North Korea is a pretty small country. They don't have a lot of military power, but they do have nuclear weapons. So, North Korea gets treated with kid gloves. Well, in the position I was in Venezuela, I didn't have a lot of power, but I knew that they couldn't kill me. The people in the prison would be, they'd be put in prison if I died. So I was willing to push things physically up to the point where they said, you know what? We can't safely continue this with Matthew. Let's just give him let's leave him alone. He wants to keep breaking the cameras. Well, we'll stop putting cameras in his rooms.
That's great. You did it. That's exactly what you wanted.
Those little wins. It's all, and again, like in the bigger scheme of things, like, did that get me home any faster? I don't know. But by feeding my spirit, that's what keeps a person alive in that kind of situation. And, to be quite honest with you, I think it's pretty rare in our culture to have somebody like me who has these, over 2 years of experience of being detained. And that's why I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak to people, which, I know we're going to get into later, but I really love talking about prevention. And it's a very fulfilling part of my job is to work on getting people home that had been kidnapped or detained. But I take the real satisfaction from teaching people prevention, how to not become kidnapped or wrongfully.
Right. Exactly. Okay, well, we will definitely get into that. But my last question on this is just, you get home, you see your family.
Yeah.
I did read that your son was 13 at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, what is that like? I mean, and honestly, like, what do you talk about? Are you telling them everything that happened? Are you, obviously protecting them from some things? My grandfather used to work in the Pentagon and used to tell us, I can't talk to you about anything. What was that feeling like of being back in your hometown?
Yeah. Well, so on the one hand, I've been in the intelligence community for over 20 years, so I'm no stranger to not telling people about certain aspects of my life. But to be quite honest with you, it was shocking. I was in shock for weeks. It took weeks for me to become acclimatized to being back. It was surreal. It felt like I was in another world. It didn't feel like reality. And those kinds of mental health concerns are really common in people who've been detained in difficult situations for long periods of time. And, what do you talk about? Honestly, I didn't want, me personally, I didn't like big groups of people. I didn't want to talk to a lot of people. I wanted to talk to my family members, and I pretty much didn't want to talk to anybody else. And it took me weeks and weeks to really feel comfortable, just doing something normal like going to the grocery store.
Right. Yeah, I can't even imagine that just the even believing that you have freedom would be crazy.
Yeah, well, the violation of trust that happens when you're wrongfully detained, when you're framed for ridiculous crimes, it definitely causes you trust issues. And yeah, like that permeates every part of your life where you don't trust anything. You don't trust anything.
Right. I do have to ask, what happened with your boat?
The Venezuelan government sent a military intelligence officer to Nashville, Tennessee. They transferred the title of my boat to them. They flew to Aruba, took possession of it, and stole my boat.
Are you serious?
I'm dead serious. And all this happened while I was detained. Fortunately, they left part of as part of the legal proceedings in Nashville, they had to leave a copy of their passport and the falsified paperwork where I'd done a letter, a power of attorney, and transferred a power for them to take possession of it. And of course, the FBI is working on this case, and knock on wood, maybe they'll find my boat one day.
Oh my God! It could have been blown up. It could have been one of the ones blown up.
I have joked with my lawyers about that.
Oh my God, that is crazy.
Yeah. So the FBI is working the case right now, but the Venezuelan government is a kleptocracy. They'll steal the paint off the walls.
I am shocked that would even be a thought.
Oh, you'd never heard of that? Well, again, this goes back to the work that I do now is I leverage my experiences. That most people don't think about these things. Well, if you were detained in a foreign country, would you ever imagine that falsified legal documents could be created? Military intelligence could fly to America and effectively steal your assets?
No.
Yeah,
No.
well, it happens. That's absolutely a concern.
Oh my God. That just blew my mind. Oh my gosh. Okay. So now let's get into prevention. You've become involved with Hostage US and the Bring Our Families Home campaign,
Yes.
correct? How are you? I mean, do you even? I guess this is kind of a weird question. In this prevention part of it, like,
Hmm.
would you ever travel abroad again the way that you did?
Exactly the way that I did. No, I'd probably avoid the part where I got detained.
But I mean, like, okay, so you're working with these organizations. If there was a time where you had to travel abroad to help somebody or something
Yeah.
like that, would you hesitate to do
No. Well, there might be some hesitation, but I'm a Marine. I'm going to do what I need to do.
that? Okay.
I was most recently working on a case. There's a woman in India who's mentally ill. She's in a very rural part of India. She's American, and it's a case that we looked at me going there and escorting her home. So that was definitely something that was considered. But before I move on to that, I want to say that there's two parts to this. I volunteer with Hostage US. We don't do a lot of prevention at Hostage US. But I wish that we did. The prevention that we do, the work on prevention is education. And then my work as an intelligence analyst is where we do, honestly, I do more of the prevention, which is educating executives on the types of threats that do exist. And then once a case comes to Hostage US, a lot of times they've already been detained. And that's where we're working on, well, we're trying to put band-aids on bullet holes, which means how can I help that person while they're detained in a country like Venezuela, Nicaragua, China, Belarus, so what comforts can we get them right now? How can we support their family? And how can we support the US government's efforts to negotiate for that person's release?
So you're talking execs like the Citgo execs that were
Yeah. Yeah,
detained.
that'd be a perfect example. Yeah, executives from obviously oil and gas executives. So we're looking at the changes that are going on in Venezuela right now. Just recently, President Trump called for massive investments from the oil majors into Venezuela if they want to take part in the future of the economic progress there. Venezuela has a history of detaining oil and gas executives. So that would be precisely the kind of people that I work with to avoid those certain behaviors that they can be exposed to avoid while they're in Venezuela. I'll give you an example. I would caution executives about public political statements. So you don't want to draw attention to yourself as an oil and gas executive who's going to travel to Venezuela. You certainly wouldn't want to criticize the Venezuelan government, make yourself an additional target. Then there's also steps that we can take where, I have relationships with the Venezuelan government because of the negotiations that took place. And to be quite honest with you, it's that kind of network down there where you can make some phone calls and say, can this person safely travel down there? And because of my years of working with these people, you can usually trust their answer. But again, at the end of the day, there's a risk to traveling to places like Venezuela. I would
And what
not I would not advise people to go to vacation right now in Venezuela.
Right. And I mean, like, so these execs, I mean, are they just in that mindset too, where they're just, they're immortal and, they're going
Yeah.
on this business adventure and, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah.
Is it just that mindset?
I mean, there's absolutely a mindset of, that's one of the challenges about working in security is somebody could say, well, I've been to these types of countries my entire career and nothing's ever happened. And they're right. It's a low probability, high impact event. And if I had a revolver that had 100 slots for a bullet in the cylinder and I put one bullet in there, and I spin it, okay, maybe an executive would say, okay, I'll take that chance. But would you give that to your kid? So now the calculus changes. No, if it was one in a million, I wouldn't do it. Well, that's what the executives need to be thinking about. Would you let your kid do this? So if it's too risky that you would send your kid, then you probably shouldn't go.
Okay. And so are you going into companies and having these discussions, or is this something where, they're in the process of maybe planning on going to,
Hmm.
say, Venezuela, and
Yeah.
you jump in at that point?
It's honestly, it's all different kinds. So that there are companies that have executives in foreign countries for multi-year assignments. And then we also see corporations have limited trips. So for example, executives from the United States can go visit a plant, observe manufacturing processes. We have training programs where we work with people who are stationed in foreign countries. And then we also have like shorter travel programs for people that are going to go, executives that are going to go for a short period of time, but honestly, they're pretty similar. There are some additional complications. So, for example, an executive that's going to be assigned to Mexico City for 3 years, he's going to have a home. His family's going to be there. So there's some additional considerations. Whereas, like a Coca-Cola executive that's going to go to Mexico City for 3 days, he's probably not going to take his wife and kids, and he's also probably going to be staying at a hotel.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. I didn't think about the
Hmm.
people that were actually
Hmm.
going to live there. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. Okay.
I'm,
So we just talked about your training prevention for executives that are going in the countries. My thought automatically goes to the everyday person that
yeah.
is, the influencers that are doing these solo travel events
Hmm.
and, documenting all of it, or, just cruise people. People are on a cruise and they go into these different ports. What kind of prevention is happening with those types of people?
That's a great question. There's definitely more people who are traveling for vacation than are being sent by corporations to work overseas. My biggest concern is that people that have a good heart, they think I'm not a bad person. I'm not a violent person. I would not commit these kinds of crimes. And what they don't realize is that there are people out there like that. This isn't an attack on anybody. It's the law of large numbers. So if you get 1 million people together, what are the odds that one of those guys is going to be a real big jerk? Well, they're
Right.
pretty good. In my experience, out of 1 million people, odds are pretty good there's a jerk in there. Well, when you're traveling overseas, what you don't realize is that as an American, you're more visible. So people can tell that we're different. They can tell that we're not from there. A lot of times, there's an income difference. So again, going back to, $400 for an opportunistic kidnapping, somebody in the United States is not going to do that because the laws are so strong, law and order is so strong. They know that they're facing, decades in prison for $400. The calculus just doesn't add up. Whereas in a lot of these countries that have a less strong legal justice system, it does add up. So my caution to those kinds of travelers is that it doesn't matter how good of a person you are. You need to be thinking about that there are predators exist in the world. Anywhere in the world you go, there are predators. And especially I'd like to take a moment to caution young women with the solo travel. I'm really happy that you're doing something that fulfills you, but you've absolutely got to take into account the law of averages. We're not making a value judgment on any particular country or culture. We're talking about the law of large numbers. What are the odds that somebody out there is a bad guy? Well, they're pretty good. And you got to take that into account when you're traveling. Please take your security seriously.
So is there any kind of advice that you would give somebody like that is going into, these different countries,
Yeah.
whether it be, carrying pepper spray or
Hmm.
something like that, like any kind of piece of advice that not necessarily could prevent them from being kidnapped or something, but
Yeah.
could aid in helping them through that? Or I don't know, like,
Yeah.
is there anything that you can do?
Well, again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So I would research any particular place that somebody is looking to go to. And if they have elevated levels of of violent crimes, then I would avoid going there. If I know that a neighborhood has a really high likelihood of me getting assaulted, I just don't go to the neighborhood. That's a victory. So any battle that we can avoid is a battle won. That being said, if I was going to travel through an area that was maybe on the borderline of my decision of to go there to not go there, you're going to want to try to take, for example, we're traveling in taxi cabs. You're going to take their applications where, you can share the driver, the car, the license plate number with your friends and family so that they know what car you're in. And then the drivers also know somebody besides this person knows that they're
Yeah.
with me. So there's a chain of custody there. And that's the type of travel that I would encourage people to take. Just hopping on the back of the first motorcycle taxi that comes up, that's a real bad decision. Let's try to use procedures where somebody knows where you're at pretty regularly. Let's talk about sharing locations, and I'm not talking about checking in like once every couple of days. So live sharing the locations, who you're with, what cars you're in. And I know that's aggravating for people, like that's just added friction to travel, but that kind of information is going to help your family members or somebody like me who gets called in. Somebody calls me and says, my daughter's missing, and I say, okay, what do we have? And you say, okay, well, 2 weeks ago she was at this hostel. That's
That's
tough.
that's a
That's
long
tough.
time.
He says, well, she went missing yesterday, and the last thing we have is she was in the taxi with this guy, this plate number in this city at this location. Okay, now we can work that case hard and maybe have a good outcome.
Is there a specific website that people could go to find out about every country and whether there is a threat?
Yeah, well, there's a couple. So first of all, the U.S. State Department has travel advisories for every country in the world that they make an assessment on the travel risks there. And then also they can go to MatthewJohnHeath.com and email me, and I'll tell them what's going on.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah, because I like I said, I don't think people think about that, and
No,
they just, they see it as a vacation or whatever it is. And I mean, and you see stories all the time of people going missing and families going missing in countries. And
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, it's just crazy. All right. So Maduro's been captured.
Yeah,
And I saw that you did an interview yesterday saying that it was like having a second Christmas
yeah,
that he was captured.
yeah.
I'm going to kind of roll this into the next thing too,
Okay.
where you have, and I don't want to specifically call out Democrat leaders, but let's call out Democrat leaders who
Mm-hmm.
are calling this, unlawful.
Mm-hmm.
Just everything, AOC, doing her whole spiel
Mm-hmm.
and, it wasn't run through Congress and all of this crap. I don't understand. I mean, his own country is celebrating the fact
Yeah.
that he has been captured. He's not a good person. And I don't even think he was truly president, right? Did I read that right?
There's definitely some argument that President Maduro is not the recognized president of
Right.
Venezuela.
Right. Yeah, I thought I read that. So now that he's been captured, I see a lot of people saying it's because of the oil. It's because of anything other than what it truly is because of, I guess.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll never know. You'll probably know before any of us what the true reason of him being captured is.
Right.
We know there's been a war on drugs forever. We know
Right.
he's already been indicted.
Yeah.
And so what are your thoughts on what happens now?
Yeah. So first of all, the criticism of President Trump, personally, I'm a pretty right down the middle kind of guy. When people criticize President Trump for every single action that he takes, it diminishes the credibility of their criticism. So if they criticize everything that he does, it's hard for me to take that any specific criticism. It's hard for me to evaluate whether that's valid criticism or not. That being said, I look at President Trump's very bold raid on Caracas yesterday and the capture of Nicolás Maduro as just a continuation of the Monroe Doctrine. So this is a continuation of a political doctrine that the United States has had for many, many years. I think it would be a failure. I think it would be a mistake to fall into binary thinking, such as this was the reason for the Maduro capture, this was the reason for the Maduro capture. Like any kind of complicated, high level political decision, this served multiple parties in multiple different ways. One of the first things that comes to my mind is how this clips the wings of a lot of the adversaries of the United States. The big two. We saw about 36 hours ago, just the day before President Maduro was captured, There was a high-level Chinese diplomatic delegation sent to Caracas to show support to Nicolás Maduro. China's invested over $100 billion into mostly oil and gas projects in Venezuela. Russia is was in a military alliance with Venezuela. There were some treaties that existed. By changing the government in Venezuela, let's not put too fine a point on it. We're lessening the influence of our two major competitors, China and Russia. There are also considerations such as there are Hezbollah links. There's a significant Lebanese population in Venezuela. The prosecutor general of Venezuela, Tarek William Saab, is Lebanese. There have been allegations of heavy Hezbollah involvement in Venezuela. Obviously, we're not a big fan of that organization. So this is one stone that kills a lot of birds. It ticks a lot of boxes, and I think that there might be. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't go to Harvard for law. I don't know what the finer points are, but more broadly, it just looks like a continuation of the Monroe Doctrine to me.
There's still 5 Americans that are wrongfully detained in Venezuela.
Yeah.
So, and I haven't heard anything about them since all of this has happened.
Right.
And I don't know if I've just missed it, but why is that not a news story? Why is that not what people are talking about?
Yeah.
And what happens with these people now? Are we going to be able to get them out?
Well, I want to be clear that we will absolutely get those 5 people back. I don't know when, and I'm not sure on the exact mechanism. There are many available to us, but I want to be clear that we absolutely will get those people back. And, it's difficult to know if their family members are listening right now. Perhaps they will get this message, but I want to send a special message to those family members and say that the U.S. government, beyond the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs at the Department of State, beyond his office, and that office is one of the most amazing offices in the U.S. government, there are hundreds and thousands of people in all different parts of the government that their entire job is working day and night to get your family members back home. So do not lose hope. People work on this 20 hours a day, and we're going to get your family members back. So has anything like this ever happened before? The closest analog that I can think of is when the U.S. government arrested Manuel Noriega in, I think it was January 1990. That's the closest analog to this. Panama almost was almost a failed state with their narco trafficking. So there are some similarities with Venezuela. It is my hope, as someone who took part in the invasion and occupation of Iraq, that does not repeat in Venezuela. I hope that we don't do an invasion. I hope that we don't do an occupation. I think that a lot of U.S. service members, they absolutely support President Trump. They want him to be successful as the leader of our country. Personally, I'm not political. I cheer America. When President Trump does something good, I cheer that. If he does something bad, well, then I'm not very happy about that either.
Exactly.
And I'm not an ideologue. That means it's not a cult of personality. He's not perfect. When he makes mistakes, he should be, those should be criticized. And on the other side of the coin, when he does successes, he should be applauded for them, because really we should all hope that President Trump succeeds, because he's the leader of our country. And if he's successful, then America's successful. And that being said, what's going to happen in Venezuela? Well, I mean, if I had that crystal ball, I'd be worth about $1 trillion right now.
Yeah.
I'd like to see a transitional government where interim vice president, now she's interim president, Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela. I'd like to see a transition. We still have the upper levels of the political structure in Venezuela are intact. I'd like to see her work very closely with the United States, schedule elections within the next 30 to 60 days. Let's call some snap elections. Let's let the Venezuelan people choose their next leader. I'd like to see investigations. I'd like to see the human rights violations that have occurred in Venezuela investigated, and where appropriate, prosecuted. Of course, I'd like to see a change in the security situation in Venezuela. The United States is the natural market for Venezuela. we're so much closer geographically than China is. It just makes natural sense for them to sell their natural resource products to the United States. So I think that Venezuela is one of the richest countries in the world. They have some of the largest proven oil reserves. They have almost every natural resource you could imagine. They have diamonds, gold, uranium, iron ore, zinc. They have everything. They have everything. They don't have winter in Venezuela. They have 3 growing seasons a year. It's some of the most productive fishing grounds in the world. It's a country that should be absolutely wealthy, and the people should be incredibly wealthy and happy. Unfortunately, right now they're living in absolute poverty because of the mismanagement of the entire country by the Maduro regime. So there's nowhere to go but up from here. And I'm really hoping for Venezuela. I hope that this is a new dawn for the people of Venezuela. Some of the military officers, they might have been detained for 10 years without a trial.
Oh my God.
Just because they opposed President Maduro politically. They didn't even do any actions. They just said in a conversation, I don't support him. I think that somebody else should be the leader of Venezuela. That's enough. There's no trial. Just go straight to prison.
Imagine if Trump did that.
Oh my goodness. I mean,
Can you
I
imagine?
know what a dictatorial regime looks like. This ain't it. This is not it. Look, Trump's not Jesus. We can criticize him for how he's done certain policies, and he does some things good and some things bad. Somebody like me cannot ever call Trump a dictator, because I know what a dictator looks like. I like President Trump a lot, but I mean, he's not perfect. He's not a dictator. That's not a criticism you could ever give President Trump.
Well, and that's just ignorance on, again, like I said, it's a personality thing.
It's a childish thing. I mean, it's like, it's like when they're calling President Trump a Nazi. Okay. I mean, that's rhetoric. That's rhetoric where they're using emotion. Logically, he's obviously not part of the Nazi party, right? So legalistically, he's not a Nazi. You could say he might have like a valid criticism might be, or a logically consistent criticism might be that he has, authoritarian tendencies. Okay, that's a logically valid statement. We can argue whether it's true or not, but it's not accurate to say it's a Nazi.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. I can't even tell you how much I appreciate you sharing your story with us, and just crazy, crazy stuff. I can't wait to read your book when it comes out.
It's going to be a page turner.
I bet. I hope you give more details and of different ways to annoy the captors. Make that like a bonus section at the end.
Jennifer, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and I'll leave that. I'll put that chapter in there just for you. How to annoy your captors in Venezuelan prison.
Well, thank you again so much, and it was really wonderful talking with you.
It was lovely speaking with you, and I look forward to getting the opportunity again.
This has been Reasonable Arguments, News and Nonsense. There is so much BS on the mainstream media news, but you knew that. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. See you next time.